Good morning, and I'd like to call the Education Effectiveness Committee to order. May I have a roll call, please, ma'am?
Mr. Akaboki, not in attendance. Mr. Castillo,
Here.
Dr. Davis, here. Ms. Ellis, here. Mr. Garvey,
Here.
Ms. Holloway, here. Mr. Mellering,
Here.
Mr. Morris,
Here.
Ms. Orange-Jones, here. Mr. Rock,
Seven.
Ms. Voce, here. And Ms. Roy is here. I saw her.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. Okay. First item, please.
Your consent agenda is ready for your approval, adding items 4.1, 5.1, 5.2, 5.3, and 6.2.
So moved.
So moved. Do I have a second? Second by Ms. Jones. The motion, you have some questions? There are no any options? Hearing none, the motion passes. Next item, please.
Your first item is on page 1, item 2.1, consideration of a report regarding STEM-focused undergraduate teacher preparation programs. The department recommendation is to receive the report prepared by RNC Research Corporation.
There's a motion. Motion by Ms. Roche. Second. Second by Ms. Jones.
The report is in your packet, board members, and our recommendation to receive.
Any discussion? Hearing none, motion passes. Next item, please.
Your next item is on page 31, item 3.1, consideration of an update report regarding the early literacy work group. The department recommendation is to receive.
May I have a motion, please? Motion by Moore, second by Dr. David. You got the report.
Yes, sir, Mr. Rock. At this time, Deputy Assistant Superintendent M. Cooper will make a report to the board.
Thank you, Dr.
Good morning.
Good morning.
The department presented the teacher preparation quality rating system report to you all this March, and that report included trends from the 2018-2019 and 2019-2020 performance profiles that were assigned during the accountability systems learning phase. Although the report consists of promising trends regarding how our preparation providers are improving as the system is phasing in, it also highlights a need for a comprehensive coverage of research-based literacy instruction. To support teacher preparation providers in strengthening literacy training, BESE charged the department with 3 things: providing PD funding to ensure literacy faculty-attended professional development that is grounded in research-based reading instruction, clarifying expectations relative to literacy coursework by convening an early literacy work group, and assessing literacy knowledge and skills as part of initial licensure. So today, I'm going to give you all an update on the early literacy work group, including an overview of the work group, the recommendations and discussions that have been had, and some next steps. The work group has been structured in 3 phases as outlined on the screen. During each phase of work, the work group will execute several outcomes. So the first phase was individual meetings, where we met with each member of the work group to evaluate how their pre-K through 3 and then elementary 1st through 5th grade programs were structured in their course materials and syllabi to address the 9 hours of literacy coursework. We also talked through the materials and how teacher prep programs had strengths in literacy training and how they've aligned their coursework with research-based literacy instruction. The second phase of the work group consisted of meetings where we understood how those preparation providers were strong in literacy training that addressed the 9 hours of reading instruction, and then also just clarified expectations around the 9 hours of reading. And then the last phase will be a second work group meeting where we will discuss recommendations aligned to assessments and also a time frame to phase in those recommendations. The participants of the work group are listed here. They include teacher preparation providers, school system leaders, and literacy experts that were there to clarify expectations around the research-based literacy instruction with that 9 hours of coursework that is required. These school system leaders, teachers, and providers were selected based on feedback from our academic content teams and literacy teams. And we also selected the preparation providers that had those strengths in literacy according to their quality review. So during the first phase of the work group, we asked these questions in those individual meetings to better understand how policy requirements should be updated to address this 9 hours of literacy that are required. And some things that we learned were that we require aspiring educators that are pursuing certification in pre-K 3 and elementary to complete at least 9 hours of reading instruction. And our teacher preparation providers had strengths in literacy training. They exceeded those 9 hours. So of our preparation providers and the representatives in this work group, those programs did more than 9 hours, and those are the same programs that showed strength in literacy. There's also quite some variability in the number of hours that our providers require, ranging anywhere from 12 to 18 course hours of literacy. Another question we asked was around how have the providers with strengths in literacy structured their coursework to address those 9 hours. And we found that they build in opportunities to build in knowledge of the reading strands and practice implementing the 5 strands of reading. They also have structured coursework to address all 5 strands of reading across their literacy courses. And other providers structured the coursework to target each reading strand while also strategically connecting learning across all 5 strands of reading. We also asked the work group about the knowledge gaps that are most prevalent for teachers when they enter the profession and what strands of reading are the most difficult for aspiring educators to implement. And our preparation programs and our school system leaders identified phonics and phonological awareness as a hurdle for new teachers and aspiring educators. We also learned that our school system leaders' greatest concern is that most of the novice teachers lack a deep understanding in all 5 strands of reading. And so when teachers have knowledge of those 5 strands of reading, it's difficult for them to shift theoretical knowledge to teaching and learning practices. It's also difficult for our teachers to differentiate instruction, implement targeted interventions, and set an appropriate learning path to address the diverse needs of students and struggling readers. And then the last question we asked was around how our school systems are structuring cycles of professional learning to ensure that our new teachers are prepared to implement instruction. And our school system leaders indicated they have structured professional development opportunities to introduce them into research-based literacy instruction. They also provide coaching and feedback cycles to teachers and that have professional learning communities where teachers can collaborate with each other to address the 5 strands of reading. They also indicated that their teachers are exposed to strategies and interventions that are aligned to each strand of reading. During the second phase of meetings, this is where everyone met together, we shared a summary of those key findings from phase 1, and the work group discussed 3 policy recommendations to address the 9 hours of reading. And those recommendations are below. So the first one is that they could address the 5 strands of reading separately across courses to ensure that all of the candidates have a deep understanding of each strand. The second one is to address the 5 strands of reading together across courses and then gradually increase the depth of knowledge to ensure that each teacher candidate understands those strands. And then the third one is to address each of those strands separately and then integrate them into each course so that they have a deeper knowledge of those strands. In addition to convening the work group to clarify these expectations of the 9 hours, BESE also charged the department with providing professional development funding to ensure literacy faculty attend PD grounded in research-based instruction. Act 108, which was recently enacted, requires all K through 3rd grade teachers and leaders to be trained in a foundational literacy skills instruction course that's based on the science of reading. The PD includes information on instructing students regarding phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. And our literacy team has secured funds to also offer teacher preparation providers the opportunity to attend the same training across the state. So the next work group meeting will be next month in September. And the work group will discuss the recommendations that I just shared with you in regards to the 9 hours of required reading, and then also how to incorporate those 9 hours of reading instruction that are required by Louisiana revised statute. And that is an update on where we are with the work group. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Connie. Questions from the board? Ryan?
First of all, Ms. Cooper, thanks so much for that update. Superintendent Brumley, this is very exciting work. And I know there's a lot of pieces to the puzzle. The data that we've all read from the progress from the state of Mississippi and the tremendous progress that they've made, my understanding is in 2013 they initiated their program. And by 2019, their national ranking had jumped from 49th to 29th. So, significant jump in progress. And obviously, everybody in the country is really impressed by that. There's a blueprint now that's out there. Dr. Chase and I had some really good conversations on this topic, so I appreciate her time and helping me to understand the fundamentals here. But one of the things we talked about was, what is Louisiana's goal with regard to progress in that national ranking, given what Mississippi's accomplished in 6 years? So I was hoping that we could get some comment from your team with regard to what is Louisiana's goal. What does that time frame look like?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Morris. I'll ask Dr. Chazon to come up, but as she walks up, I just want to acknowledge Mississippi is about 8 years ahead of us in terms of policies and practices that they've implemented. But this board is to be commended, frankly, for leading out over the last year on a number of various literacy endeavors. And it's not just about, what are we doing in terms of early accountability, but it's also about teacher training. It's also about access. There are so many things that go into making this happen. And I'm just so pleased of where this board stands in terms of pushing this particular issue. And many of you have been strong leaders on this. A couple of things I'll mention too around the report that Ms. Cooper provided. It mentions the legislation from Senator Mills, which requires all of our K-3 teachers and administrators in the state to go through a science of reading training. And that's going to be an intense training that's high quality for our teachers, and they need and deserve that. And many have been asking for that. So that process is taking place. The other piece that I'll mention is just Senator Hewitt's legislation that is now in law, which as a part of that, not only does it mandate some level of accountability in K2, but it also calls for 9 hours explicitly in the science of reading training for pre-service teachers. And so that's what we're trying to get right in this process in working with our university providers to make those shifts in those areas of training. Dr. Chasson has been working a good bit looking at various data points, and so I'd be happy to have her share out some of her findings.
Sure, absolutely. Good morning.
Good morning.
And I'm happy to share with you all today. We have been taking a look at fourth grade NAEP reading results. We think this is a great place to set a literacy goal for our state, especially Mr. Morris, to your point, when we look at Mississippi and the great literacy improvements and achievements that have happened in our neighboring state. So we've learned a lot. The whole country has learned a lot from Mississippi. We engage with the folks that have done that work over the years there regularly. So we've learned some of their hits and some of their misses and how they were able to achieve such great things for the kids of their state. And so when we look at the Mississippi data, their legislation around literacy that really kicked off this movement for them was passed during their 2013 legislative session. And so if we track the cohorts of students that impacts, it took 6 years for them to see a significant amount of growth. We saw a steady increase over the years. The fourth grade NAEP reading assessment is administered every other year, every 2 years. And so by 2019, we saw the students who were really reaping the benefits of the professional development, of the literacy coaching, the similar legislation that we now have in this state, passed in our last legislative session, entered the fourth grade and took that fourth grade NAEP test. And so those were the students who had the most impact from their kindergarten year through fourth grade. And we saw their average scale score grow 10 points, which pushed them from around us, 48, 49 is where we hover and where Mississippi used to hover in NAEP rankings for fourth grade reading. We saw them jump up to that 29th spot. And so we would like to set a similar goal, which would put us, if we track those same cohorts of students and where Mississippi saw their significant growth, if we track from the 2021 legislative session that is enacted this school year, the professional development begins this school year, that would mean that we would track those kindergarten students, which would set our goal for the 2027 fourth grade NAEP reading results to see an increase of 10 scale score points. If we see rankings remain steady, this would push us in the high 20s. What we don't know is what the impact of COVID will be. Not even just thinking about us, but about our country. And so I'm not sure, we can't say for sure what the 2027 NAEP fourth grade reading rankings will look like. But if they would remain steady, this would push us in the high 20s. Of course, if other folks see a lot of gains, if other folks see a lot of loss around the country, it could push us in a different ranking spot. But I think a 10-point difference is both rigorous, especially considering that we are not just working in the same parameters that Mississippi did. 2013 to 2019 in education is a very different place than 2021 to 2027 in a pandemic and post-pandemic world. So I still think a 10-point goal is very rigorous, but still achievable in consideration of the great work that we're seeing beginning this past school year and then heading into the future.
Thank you. So in summation, is it fair to say that in 6 years that Louisiana would expect to be at least one ranking point ahead of Mississippi?
If the ranking stayed steady, what we don't know is what will happen in Mississippi, so we don't know for sure. But we can, I think, set a goal to see very similar growth. Like I said, I think that is still very ambitious in consideration that this time span, these years look very different now in pandemic and post-pandemic world.
Thank you. And Dr. Morgan, appreciate that your team is setting ambitious goals. Thank you.
Dr. Davis?
I would just like to echo what you just said, that I think that we ought to be focusing on growth rather than rankings, because we're not the only state in the country that has noticed what Mississippi is doing. So Arkansas, Texas, we have a number of states that are pursuing the Mississippi model, and so it would be a huge mistake for us to focus on our ranking. What we really need to be focused on is our growth and how we're moving students. But I'd also like to ask a question. Just in the report, I noticed that you mentioned that one of the issues that our schools are facing with novice teachers is that they're coming in and they're feeling, their administrators feel like they're struggling going from the theoretical to the practical implementation of those strands in the classroom. And so I'm curious, is that a function of during our residency program that they're then have mentor teachers who perhaps are not as well-versed in the science of reading as they should be? And do we expect Act 108 is going to remedy that problem, if that's what it is?
That's a wonderful question, and we certainly can't say as an absolute that it is all current teachers who have that struggle or that lack of knowledge, because that's certainly not the case. But I would absolutely expect Dr. Davis to see that mentor teachers in the future have a more robust skill set around the foundations of reading as a result of Act 108 that indeed will transfer to their student residents.
Thank you.
Mr. Carter?
Yes, put a little exclamation point behind the point that Ronnie, Mr. Morris is making about Mississippi. We've relied on Mississippi for a long time to keep us out of last place. So this is a scary situation. Some people concerning Mississippi have said that maybe it's not fair for us to shoot to beat Mississippi because Louisiana has a higher low-income population percentage than Mississippi. Do you know if that is true? Okay. Well, if not, I was asking Mr. Morris.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I thought you had read the same report that I had read, which says that in fact Mississippi has a higher low-income population than Louisiana, which is sometimes used as a justification or a reason for us having low test scores. But Mississippi is doing better with a higher percentage of low income. Some people say that it may not be fair for us to compare ourselves to Mississippi because maybe they're spending more money per student than we are spending. Do you remember seeing that on that report?
Yeah, I don't recall those details, Mr. Garvey. What I would say is that expectation is that we're trying to set all of our children up for success, and they're going to be competing in a global economy, and that means they're going to be competing against a lot of people other than just Mississippi. So I'd like to think that we're preparing them to compete and be successful in that global economy, and not just in our backyard in Mississippi.
I would agree with that, but I'd point out that my memory also indicates that Mississippi is spending less money per student than Louisiana, which gives us even less reason, or more reason for us to shoot to beat Mississippi, or at the very least, as Ms. Davis said, get our growth way, way up there as they have done. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Buffett?
Thank you. I'm interested in talking a little bit about the milestones along the way. You mentioned the 2027 goal of the 10 points on NAEP, but I would like to hear from you about how we'll know if a year from now the things that we've done are making an improvement.
Yeah, that's a great question, Dr. Bosey. And one of the things that we've been really working so hard on is to release an RFP for a statewide literacy screener. And so we have been engaged in that process over the last year. It's a very long, lengthy process. And so we are nearly at the point of selection for that screener, and that statewide literacy screener will really help us have valid and reliable data around K-2 literacy. You all have heard me share that at this point we don't necessarily have that. Our schools currently choose from 4 different screeners, and it is not a secure test administration. And so we have that data, but it is not the most secure data, the most valid and reliable data. And so that will get better in time to come. We're hoping for next school year to have that in place, and so we'll be able to see the growth in that from year to year. For this year, we certainly have our the continuation of our literacy coaching pilot that will continue, so we will have data from middle school sites, but we will see over time that literacy screener, that statewide assessment that we'll have. Also, when NAEP administration does begin again, we will be able to see in the every other year that NAEP is assessed prior to that 2027. I will say, looking at Mississippi's data in depth, they did show progress. They didn't just jump from 2013 to 2019. They did show some small gains initially to that 2019 point.
Thank you. So you've released the RFP and you're, I guess, waiting, I know that's a lengthy process, but you expect the screener to be in place in the 21-22 school year, is that right? Or the 22-23?
The 22-23 school year, so we're in the review process, and we would hope to begin training teachers on it this spring to administer for next school year.
Okay, and then can you talk to me about the scale of the coaching pilot?
So the coaching pilot, you all remember I presented to you last year a few times, and the coaching pilot was 13 schools. And so we are continuing that coaching pilot in 12 of the 13 schools that decided to continue the pilot. And so they are in year 2, so they are going a step ahead of the 250 coaches that we have this year across the state in our CIR schools, so our comprehensive intervention required schools. Many school systems have said we want a coach, and so we were able to provide that funding from our federal literacy grant.
Okay, and does the 250 cover all of our CIR schools?
No, it was not. It does not. This was an opportunity for school systems to say we want a literacy coach,
Okay.
and so some chose not to have one.
And what training did the coaches receive?
The coaches receive a whole host of trainings. So they started this summer with a variety of trainings. They'll end up going through the same trainings included in Act 108, that foundational reading training. We also will be hosting some communities of practice throughout the year for the coaches to come together. They have ongoing coaching support through literacy specialists at their school sites.
Thank you.
Any other board members?
Thank you, Mr. Rock. Dr. Shansell, my question is in regards to securing funds for this teacher prep work that's so important for guaranteeing effective teachers. How can we reassure this board and the state educators that there's going to be secured funds to continue this work and training? Because I recall from the last meeting we spoke about this, that supposedly funds or until a certain year, but I don't recall that time frame. And then maybe the districts would pick up on this. How do we secure and guarantee that this model will continue to be above Mississippi? That we can continue this training with our coaches, our educators, our colleges, etc. Can you kind of give us a time frame? Because I don't see a time frame here.
Yeah, absolutely. So sustainability is always on our mind, especially when we think about grant funding, when we think about our COVID relief dollars. And so one of the things that we're working on in accordance with Act 108 is that we are able to use ESSER dollars to fund the science of reading training, not only for the teachers in our schools, but right now also for student residents, for candidates in our teacher preparation programs. We're able to help those folks get trained as well as they matriculate into our schools and become our teachers. In the future, we also have a project where we are building our own science of reading training that will be owned by the department. And so that training will be free of charge to our teacher prep candidates, to our teachers. We know through the years we'll have teachers who move here from out of state, we'll have teachers who come from another field and become alternatively certified. And so we will have our own science of reading training that we'll be able to offer to all of those folks as well.
Any concerns of gaps that you may not have the capacity to train our teachers moving forward? I'm talking about 3 years, 4 years, 5 years down the road and further.
No, I'll say that's one thing we're thinking a whole lot about right now and working our way through. The good thing is that short term we do have extra dollars to help. So right now we have vendors who will be able to do that training, because right now we need whole armies of trainers, and so we have vendors on an approved guide that we solicited through an RFA process, and that gives us some time to stand up a science of reading training that is sustainable.
Motion?
Okay. How much collaboration are we doing with colleges and universities and the teacher preparation programs while we're making this massive effort to do the science of reading training with existing staff? I would hope that as teaching candidates emerge from the colleges and universities and our teacher prep programs, that would have been done as a regular part of their curriculum, with the practical experience coming when they do their residency or possibly some of their field work. But the actual training on it, I would have told that we would be collaborating with our teacher prep programs at all levels to make sure that it's included in their programs.
So I would say two things. One, this work group is tasked to make sure that that happens. So they are going to make the recommendation for how those courses should be structured in the prep programs. And then two, we are funding all of our prep providers to attend and receive the science of reading and training that we're giving to all of our teachers as well. So it's twofold.
So hopefully the need for the department to make a big push as every candidate emerges from college, it would lessen if it was part of the curriculum that they had to take to become teachers.
Right now we're doing both sides of it, but you're correct. Once we have all of our teachers trained and then our candidates have gone through a program where these changes have been made, they would have received that.
David?
So I'm really excited about this and the professional development and the resources we're going to give our teachers to hone in on like the updates that have been made in how we teach literacy. But the other big part of this is that the RFP for the literacy screener. And as I talk to teachers about what they want, I just want to reiterate, when I hear their voices, what they tell us is they don't want a literacy screener that just shoots out a number and a score. What they want is a diagnostic tool that they can then look at that and unpack that score into the various areas that that student needs improvement in. And so I know I've said that before, but just reiterating, please give us a good literacy screener that teachers can really use to move kids.
What else? For discussion, yes.
I'm sorry, Dr. Davis triggered another thought. On the literacy screener, whenever you developed your RFP, I was curious if there would be anything in the RFP that addresses dyslexia and the process for including screening dyslexia with the assessment.
What I can say is that any good literacy screener will include components in it that would identify characteristics of dyslexia. That would be a part of any strong literacy screener. Yeah.
Okay, so that would definitely be included in your RFP.
Yeah.
So just piggybacking on that, are you saying that right now, prior to the third grade, we're supposed to be screening every child in our system for dyslexia? So what are you saying then, the screener that we're going to use as a universal screener for everyone will also be able to detect that and we don't have to do an additional screener?
I can't say that for sure, Dr. Boche. I will say that what I said before, that any good literacy screener will help to identify characteristics of dyslexia. Best practices in identifying dyslexia, students who have dyslexia, would call for multiple measures and multiple data points.
But it would give us an initial idea that this child may be, it's
As the ones
appropriate
do
for
now,
an additional screener or additional testing.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it could also be efficiency step, right? So
Right.
if you include that with your RFP, and you could save some money elsewhere and some time elsewhere, avoid some redundancy in your testing.
Anyone else? Okay, do we have any objection to the motion? Hearing none, the motion passes. Next item, please.
The next item is on page 45, item 4.2, consideration of revisions to Bulletin 746, Louisiana Standards for State Certification of School Personnel regarding teacher certification requirements and technical edits. The department recommendation is to approve as a notice of intent the repeal of Bulletin 746, chapters 1 through 8 and 10 through 13. Approve as a declaration of emergency the reestablishment of Bulletin 746 sections as outlined, effective August 18, 2021, for a period of 180 days or until adopted as final rule, and approve as a notice of intent the reestablishment of Bulletin 746, Chapters 1 through 8, and Chapters 11 through 25. An additional page of the PowerPoint deck has been distributed.
We have a motion. Moved by Mr. Jones, and second, Ms. Holloway. Presentation?
Yes, there is.
Mr. Rock,
Yes.
Christy Ballou, who leads our certification team, is here to make a few comments and answer any questions.
Thank you, Doc.
Good morning. Just to give you a little bit of information about what these proposed policy changes are around. My staff and I work in Bulletin 746 every day, and a lot of these changes come out of the daily implementation of our certification bulletin. Some of these changes come from stakeholders. Some of these changes we've seen through our appeals process, things that are repeatedly appealed. And some of these changes are simply for clarity and consistency. So there are a lot of proposed changes here, many pages that you have been provided. What I'm going to talk through today are the high points and where each of these changes fall. There's three major groups of changes: substantial changes, changes for policy clarity and consistency, and then technical issues and corrections. So the first few things that are a little bit more substantive in changes are the removal of in-area of certification language. When an educator is advancing from a level 1 to a level 2 teaching certificate, there are 2 requirements in place currently. Current policy requires 3 effective evaluations via Compass and 3 years of teaching experience in their area of certification. This particular change was brought to us by our HR personnel group, LaSASPA. They noted that oftentimes incoming teachers are just trying to get a job in education, and they're often asked by their school system to teach out of their area. And if an educator has been teaching out of their area for a couple of years, per policy or current policy, it kind of prevents their advancement of their career. LaSASPA has indicated to us that they would rather an effective teacher with the 3 years of experience and feel like that a teacher that can get an effective rating that is teaching outside of their area is a teacher they want to keep. So this particular box, so to speak, or little issue is something that we're trying to correct. So we're going to keep the 3 effective evaluations and the 3 years of teaching experience. We're simply removing the language that indicates that it has to be in their area of certification. And so in doing this, from the advancement from the level 1 to the level 2 teaching certificate, similar requirements are also listed in our Ed Leader 1, 2, and 3, and in our out-of-state superintendent. So we're trying to make that language consistent across policy. So throughout policy, we're proposing to remove the in-area of certification language to eliminate that barrier. Some other major things that we're proposing to change that were brought forth by several different stakeholders. You see them on this particular slide here. Some things like including the general medical excuse in policy. There's one listed in policy, and over the years with the copy paste and editing the policy, it ended up in one section only, where the initial intent was to have it in the general section, so we're putting it back in the general section of policy. Some other items brought forth by the early childhood team are things like adding a family child care as an option for a CDA to earn the early childhood ancillary certificate. Other major changes, including bringing school counselor and school librarian renewals in alignment with law. Our practices since the implementation of the law for renewal of effectiveness have been in alignment with law, but this particular part of policy just got left out. So while it's a major shift in the policy, it won't be a major shift in our practices because we've been following the laws there. Some other major shifts that we're proposing include practitioner license submission. Current policy requires practitioner licenses to be submitted by the school system for certain types or by the teacher preparation provider for certain types of PLs. This seems to cause a lot of confusion out in the field. There's been some instances where individuals are not issued a PL because one particular person, either the school system thought the provider was going to apply or the provider thought the school system was going to apply. So we're proposing that all practitioner license submissions be done by the teacher preparation program providers. That way there will be no confusion. And it's kind of in alignment with our other pre-service certificates. The resident certificate is submitted by the teacher preparation provider, and initial certification is also submitted by the teacher preparation provider. So we feel like this alignment will help out and decrease the confusion. We are also proposing, in conjunction with the career and tech team, to update and align the structure of the CTTIE certificates to align with the structure and the renewal similar to what standard level teaching certificates are. So current structure for CTTIE, it depends on when it was issued to you, what credentials you have, how it's renewed, how you advance. And so this will eliminate the confusion there. And it will also, another thing that we found is sometimes our HR folks in school systems aren't familiar with this type of certificate. And because it stands out so differently from the rest, bringing in alignment with our standard certificates will help to eliminate that confusion there. So its renewal and its structure will be similar to the level 1, 2, and 3 teaching certificates. Other major changes include the adoption of new high school and middle school math exams. You may have seen that high school math is a pretty beast of a test to pass. ETS has recently restructured both the middle school math and the high school math exam. And we are adopting it in hopes that this restructure will help increase the passage rate of both of those exams and hopefully increase our number of math educators out there as well. We are also including the Louisiana Leadership Assessment Series exam. That was included in one portion of policy. However, it was not included in the ed leadership portion of policy for us to actually be able to use it to issue an EDL. So we're just moving that and including that in policy. Another major shift is the reduction of the required teaching years for ed leader certification, for ed leader 3. Currently, there's a bit of a mismatch between ed leader 1 and 2 and ed leader 3 certification. Ed leader 1 and 2 require 3 years of teaching experience, and right now it says in area of certification, but of course we're going to be removing that in alignment with the previous change that I mentioned. But an ed leader 3 requires 5 years of teaching experience. And so to bring this particular certificate in alignment with our other 2 ed leader certificates, we're going to reduce the number of years of teaching experience from 5 to 3. All other requirements will remain the same. We don't want to penalize an educator that moved out of the classroom after 3 years and they can become a principal several years down the road when they decide to become superintendent. So to align with that particular change, we'll be also reducing the number of years of teaching experience for our out-of-state superintendent certificate as well, so that it matches our ed leader 3. Some other major shifts include options for non-public school educators to serve as a mentor teacher. Current policy allows for uncertified charter teachers to serve as a mentor teacher. However, there is no provision in policy to allow for uncertified non-public school educators to serve as a mentor teacher. So we're proposing similar language for uncertified non-public school educators to be able to serve as a mentor teacher. We are also proposing to update the TAT, Temporary Authority to Teach, GPA requirements. Last year, there was a GPA flexibility statute put in place that allowed practitioners who didn't have the required GPA a flexible option for entrance into a practitioner teacher program. Well, the TAT certificate is kind of a springboard for that PL certificate, and we did not edit or update the TAT GPA requirements. So it's like its gatekeeper was a little bit more stringent for the TAT than it was for the PL. If someone didn't have the appropriate GPA for the TAT, all they had to do was enter into the PL program under the flexible options and move forward. So this is to align that particular policy for TAT GPA to allow a flexible option similar to what we have with the PL. They would go through a structured interview with their employer, and we'll be providing guidance similar to what we did with the PL flexibility options. Some other major shifts include things like the removal of the Type C and the Type B eligibility requirements. We no longer issue those certificates. We do advance some of those certificates, and there's limitations on how we do that, but no one can issue those, so we're removing the eligibility requirements for that. We are also bringing child nutrition supervisor requirements in alignment with federal regulations. The next group of policy changes that we're proposing are policy changes that we're trying to implement for consistency or clarity. Things like the removal of the lapse or reinstatement sections of policy from all certificates except for lifetime certificates. It's in several places, and it's really only applicable to certificates that are not renewable via Compass. And so that causes a little bit of confusion, so we're just clarifying policy there. We are also clarifying GPA definition to be specific to undergraduate GPA. We're updating some language to be similar in all places. You know, we may have some requirements in 4 different places, and it might say it in 3 different ways. So we're going to make our language consistent across the board in all places. We are doing that for the master's waiver language, for non-education degree, things like that, so that it's more consistent. We're also clarifying the SAT score. Several years ago, the SAT changed its structure, and our policy didn't get updated to match that particular structure, so we're clarifying that in policy. To be consistent, we are also including our non-public standards from Bulletin 741. We're lifting that language and placing it in our certification bulletin. Many of our non-public schools frequently ask questions about the difference between meeting non-public standards for their staff versus certification. And so we thought it would be helpful to have all of that information in one place for our non-public stakeholders. There's also a little bit of confusion out in the field with the implementation of the teaching authorization, or TA. That's simply a credential that indicates that an individual has cleared a background check and can be in front of our students. In our certification bulletin, it also indicates authorizations. Teaching authorizations are the certifications that we issue to educators. And so we're just replacing the word authorization in our bulletin 746 with the word credential or certification, so there's no confusion between the 2 types of certificates. Someone with a credential or a certification or a license will have gone through a teacher preparation program. A teaching authorization, as it's listed in Bulletin 745, is simply a background check. We're also clarifying things around our out-of-state experience, making sure that they understand how the exam exclusion works. Any experience has to happen prior to issuance of that OS. We are including clarification around our non-public temporary certificate, and how once it's fulfilled, that particular educator will hold no certificate at all. We're clarifying the receipt of particular artifacts and things that need to be submitted to us for the talented artist policy. We we are clarifying issuance and renewal of the early childhood ancillary certificates, that those credentials have to be earned from a BESE approved provider. We're clarifying some language around the CEUs in that section. We are clarifying that coursework, work experience, and the civ area needs to be in alignment with each other when you're looking for a CTTIE or those career and tech certificates. We hope that these clarifications will reduce or eliminate some of the confusion that's out in the field. And then the last group are technical issues or corrections. What we're doing technically is we're trying to remove the exam numbers that are listed in the policy language and only have those exam numbers listed in the chart, so that when we do have to update an exam, nothing gets left out, we don't miss something. So we're going to refer to the chart only and only have exam numbers listed there. There was some automatic non-practicing language that inadvertently got put in policy a few revisions ago. We're removing that. We are updating some outdated language about safe script paper, sending things in the mail. We no longer receive applications that way. We are also reorganizing some sections of policy and trying to streamline it, and then remove duplicative language where we can. In other instances, we're also aligning policy and practices. Some of the examples are listed there about OFAT limitations and eligibility, those types of things. The last thing I want to speak to you about is we are listing some of these changes as notice of intent and some of them as emergency rule. Because a lot of these significant changes need to be in effect for this school year, and these policy revisions have been a long time coming and a long time in the making. They do need to be in effect for this school year. So the ones that will significantly change the way that we process certification applications are those changes that we're proposing to the emergency rule. All of the other items, consistency, technical issues, will be notice of intent. So some of those things listed that we're proposing as emergency rule are the practice exam updates, the in-area of certification, the practitioner license update, the TAC GPA flexibility update, mentor teacher content leader updates, the CTTIE updates, and then of course the ones that are dealing with aligning things with law, and then the reduction of the required teaching years in educational leader certification from 5 to 3. There are a lot of revisions, and in your crosswalk, I believe it was called, we went chapter by chapter from the old bulletin and listed out what all the specific changes will be. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask those now.
Thank you for that comment. Okay, comments from,
I have questions.
yes ma'am, go ahead.
You ready? So I think it's like 94 pages of changes, and they appear to me as all additions. I don't see the policy removal here though.
So there's, we are redacting or removing repealing the entire bulletin with the exception of chapter 9. And then we're reinstituting the remaining, all of it. We're reestablishing the rest of it.
Okay, so we basically, with these motions, will be repealing everything we have in policy and then replacing it with the 94 pages of information that you provided.
Yes.
Um,
There were so many changes, it was simpler to do it that way.
Everything
rather than-
except chapter 9, chapter 9 will remain.
Chapter 9, right. Can you talk to me about the groups that reviewed these changes before you brought them to us, please?
Sure. We typically, as I mentioned earlier, most of these were brought forth to us by our stakeholder groups in office hours or in the normal everyday issuance of certification. But we did also shop this past the SASPA, which is the HR or personnel group leadership. And we also shopped it past LACT leadership, which is our teacher preparation providers. And in that meeting, in those meetings, both groups felt like it was, a long time coming for most of these changes, and they didn't have any significant objections to anything that we proposed.
Can you talk us through some of the pushback you did hear?
They asked about, the specific questions that we did get were about the math exam adoption. It wasn't really pushback, it was mostly questions about what that would include. And so we provided the ETS, which is also in your document, the ETS backup that shows what ETS has done to restructure that algebra and middle school math exam. And we're hopeful that this will help to increase the passage rate for our educators for high school and middle school math.
Okay. And then with the CTTIE policy, can you talk me through the problems we were trying to solve?
Sure. Actually, my colleague Jessica Valalongo is with Career and Tech, and she probably can talk through the main issues with that. A lot of the issues that we did see were that there was a significant amount of confusion with our HR personnel and the issuance around these, just not understanding the certificates in general. But I'm going to turn it over to Jessica for that.
Yeah, so one of the things we found with HR directors is that there was a lot of confusion around how to bring someone from industry under CTTIE into education, and then once they get in there, how do they progress through 1 and 2? And so because of that confusion, it led to a lot of stigma around the work of CTE, that this was more difficult than moving through regular education. So in working with the certification office and a few CTE supervisors, we looked at what were the choke points around this work and how do we address policy to remove those choke points. One of those was getting into the profession in a level 1. The next part was moving into level 2. And so that's why we aligned it more to a traditional certification in order to make it easier. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, so can you talk me through what the major changes will be? I mean, because I understand the logistics from an HR perspective, but I just wonder, what's going to change relative to the substance of the applicant pool, the qualifications they are going to need to have?
Yeah, so the qualifications to get into the industry don't change. So you still have to have that work experience, which is kind of akin to the college degree, right? Your industry experience is what qualifies you. That doesn't change. The IBC requirement, which is kind of akin to your praxis content area, right? We're going to create kind of alignments. That doesn't change. So the quality of candidates coming in and what we measure that by doesn't change. Once you get into the education industry, that's where the process of moving changes.
Okay, so going from the provisional to the level 1 and how to move up to level 2.
Yeah, so you, with the industry experience with the IBC, you come into our industry under provisional. You get the pedagogy with the new instructor workshop. And then once you're there, you move like everyone else.
All right, thank you, I appreciate that. I do want to go back to you, Ms. Ballou, and have you show me exactly where I can see the mentor teacher updates?
Sure. So, in section 553, we're including a statement where two effective.
Can you repeat that number for, I'm sorry.
553.
Do you happen to know what page it's on in our packet?
Yes, page 111.
Thank you. So we're including a statement that will allow the non-public school educators to have 2 effective local personnel evaluations if they're uncertified to serve as a mentor teacher. And that is similar to the requirement for the uncertified charter educators. They would have to have 2 effective compass evaluations. The tool is just different because non-public school educators, the tool is a local personnel evaluation.
Okay. And then can you talk me through the school nurse and school librarian updates? I heard you say more in line with everyone else, but could you just explain what that means?
Sure. With the implementation of Compass, those were considered teaching certificates per se, and they needed to be evaluated via Compass for renewal. That's what the law requires. And so that's been our practice. However, our policy still had in it that they could renew with CLUs. And so we're removing the CLU requirement for renewal and just updating it to our standards of effectiveness.
Okay, and then I do want to go back to the reinstatement. So someone has been a teacher, they don't have the lifetime certification, so they've stepped away from the profession but might be interested in coming back into the profession. What's the process?
So because of Compass, we worked with our legal team to determine what, if reinstatement applied to folks that were renewable with effectiveness. And so the law indicates that the only way that we can renew or extend that certificate is with effectiveness. And so if it is a certificate that is renewable with Compass, like a level 1, 2, or 3, then they would just request, well, it depends on the whole scenario. Typically, if they leave the teaching profession, there's a provision of policy that allows for a pause or a freeze on their certificate. So they would request that first to preserve some of that validity. However, if they've used all of that validity already, then they would make a request for their employing school system. Typically, per policy, if there was no validity left, we would have to deny them. We would refer them to TSAC. TSAC can grant an extension for the time that they need to earn effectiveness, but essentially effectiveness is what determines the educator's readiness to be in the classroom. Whereas with a lifetime certificate, because those are not renewable via Compass, if they're out of the game, out of education for 5 years or more, then they consider that needing reinstatement. It has lapsed. And so for those certificates that are lifetime, they would have to earn coursework to reinstate it. And we do have a provision in policy that allows for a 1-year reinstatement while they earn those 6 hours of credit if needed.
Okay, so I was following you until you brought up the lifetime one. So talking about someone who came in under Compass or is, I don't even know what the number, it used to be letters, now it's number. So they would essentially need to get a job, demonstrate effectiveness, and their certificate would be reinstated. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. So someone who has a lifetime certificate, can you talk through that again?
Sure. So a lifetime certificate, their validity never ticks away. It's valid for life, essentially. However, policy indicates that if an educator with a lifetime certificate is not in the education field for 5 years or more, that's considered a lapsed certificate. And so that lapsed certificate would now need to be reinstated. So essentially, reinstatement only applies to those individuals that have a lifetime certificate. And so to reinstate a lifetime certificate after a lapse, they would need to earn 6 hours of credit to reinstate that certificate. There is a provision in policy currently that allows for a 1-year reinstatement if they're hired in the school system while they earn those 6 hours of credit. And then what we do technically is give just a 1-year validity on the certificate. We change it from lifetime to 1 year. And then once they earn those 6 hours of credit, then they reinstate their lifetime status.
And they don't have to have the effectiveness to continue their certification then, I guess would be the difference.
Correct.
Okay.
They're still evaluated. They're required by law to be evaluated. It's just not tied to their certification if they have a lifetime certificate.
Okay.
Legally, we can't take that lifetime away, except for the definitions of lapse.
This looks like a lot of hard work. Thank you so much. And it does address an issue I think a lot of board members and legislators were looped in on before the start of the year. So I also know this is a very busy time for you and your staff. Thank you for all that you guys do. I know you get really, really popular in the summertime. So please pass our appreciation on to your staff.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Davis.
I have a question about the decrease in the number of years of teaching experience for education leaders. You described it as bringing it in line with the other certificates, but the policy as it is currently written acknowledges that it's out of line with the other certificates and basically gives people who want to be superintendents the opportunity to be superintendents without having that 5 years. They're just required to hire the chief academic officer because at some point this board in writing policy decided that the superintendent ought to have 5 years of classroom experience, and if they don't, then they need to hire someone to be in charge of academics inside their district. And so I'm just curious, so we're not really just bringing something in line, we're changing what we think a superintendent ought to be able to have in terms of experience to act as his own chief academic officer. And so I'm curious about what kind of evidence we have about whether or not that making this change is a good change in terms of the academic outcomes of the district, or like, did we do any of that?
So we looked at some of the data that we have through the Teacher Certification Appeals Council and then through some recent applications of districts that applied for Educational Leadership 3 and the denials that were that we had to write to them. And we took the feedback from those school districts, various school districts around that. And it kind of prompted some other conversations about, well, what happens if you have a really good educator that taught for 3 years and they became an assistant principal and then moved on to a principal, and they still have to have their 5 years of leadership experience at the school or district level. What happens for that particular educator? Our policy indicates that they can serve as an Ed Leader 1, they can move on to an Ed Leader 2 and serve at any other district level role except for superintendent. And so in those conversations that we had, we thought that it would be helpful to just go ahead and align it with the other 2 Ed Leader certificates as well.
And so I looked at the American Superintendent 2020 decennial study that's done by one of the associations for superintendents. And so I just think that it's important to note, if we're making this change, that according to that study, over 85% of superintendents in the country have 5 years or more experience in the classroom, according to this national survey of superintendents. And so I would just be curious, since we have Mr. Falk and then Ms. Pope in the room, who school boards, pick superintendents, if you have any concerns about this change, have you heard from your membership? Did they know that this was coming? Just, I don't know if they turned in cards, or if you want to come to the table and tell us whether or not you're okay with this.
Michael Falk with the Executive Director of Louisiana Superintendents Association. No, Dr. Davis, we have not had discussions internally. We just knew that this was possibly going to be considered. We have not had discussions among our membership. Again, whatever certifications or requirements are enacted by BESE, we will follow. The role of superintendency has changed over the years. The number of people who are pursuing that has diminished. We have had about 30 vacancies over the last 4 or 5 years. That's almost half of the superintendents in the state of Louisiana. So internally, locally, you have fewer and fewer people applying for superintendents in school systems. The trend for a number of years where you had a larger number of people coming from outside the state. And so, we have not addressed that situation, but once the guidelines are established in school systems, we're going to have to follow those guidelines.
Thank you.
opportunity. Janet Pope, Executive Director of the School Boards Association. Like Mr. Falk, we have not had internal conversations and surveyed our members yet. We do plan on doing that for this year for our legislative survey. But I guess a concern just coming from the field would be that these changes, we would hope, would not stop someone who already has like an ed leader 1 or 2 from 10 years ago. That would be one concern, just off the cuff, that we would want to make sure that we would not stop anyone from becoming a superintendent at this point in time. Like Mr. Falk says, we are concerned with the number of superintendents that have retired. In the past, 4 years, he's absolutely correct. We're looking at almost half that have retired. So from the school board's point of view, our school board members are looking at wanting to have a clear pipeline for future superintendents. And also, too, we also want to say that not just educators, we have some great superintendents that were CFOs, business managers, and other jobs within the school system who do a good job. Thank you.
All right, any other board members?
Yes.
Yes, I'd like to thank Ms. Davis for bringing this issue up 5 years versus 3 years, because I had some concerns about it too. And I'd like to ask for feedback from the BESE members that are working in schools. Do y'all have concerns about this?
Well, if I may.
Please.
All right.
I wanted to say this as a talking point that I support the alignment. I can't tell you how thankful that you've done that to dig deep. As I worked in the past in human resource and also with a local district, and I see Ms. Dr. Joanne Matthews here, sitting in the back. She was our former superintendent and retired, and looking for these the effective, high-quality educators in the district that want to step up. There's a shortage of those, and we have a tremendous amount of great people out there, effective people. But I get this clarity and the consistency of the alignment. I can even go back at the time that, as an educator wanting to be a principal, I needed to have a master's degree. So I did. Janet, you were out there.
Yes.
But since then, they pull that where you need an ed degree. You don't need a master's. You know, things have changed due to the times that we're in and the shortage, and we want to encourage our people. And I want to say there are outstanding, effective people out there with 3 years of teaching that can just, some can step up into the superintendency. And so it's a mindset that years back and say, oh, I don't know about that, but now I feel that they're well-trained people to be able to step up to that. So to your question, Jim, there are shortages, there are concerns out there, but dropping it from a 5 to 3 will not, we still will encourage the most effective in our system. So I support this.
We would like
Just
to.
responding to Jim's question. Can I ask a question first before? If you're ed leader 1 or 2, it takes 3 years in the classroom. If you move ed leader 1 to become assistant principal. Ed leader 3 certifies you for superintendent. Someone who has chosen that route, for example, and who was tasked for an assistant principalship after 3 years, then moves into a principalship. Are we saying right now, if they didn't have 5 years of actual classroom experience, they could not get the level 3 as it stands right now?
That is correct.
I think that is a definite problem, because we take young talent a lot, and they may be 3 years in the classroom, we move them into an administrative role. So the part about 3 or 5 years in the actual classroom, to me, I think that does need to align, because if we move someone along that leadership path, they should be able to continue. Now, I do know that you can choose a superintendent who does not have an Ed Lead 3 certification. And that person who becomes superintendent by law just has to have a chief educational officer, whatever you want to call them, in terms of curriculum. So you may have a business person or someone coming in being a superintendent, which law allows, but they must have then an educational officer to primarily handle the curriculum, because the supposition is they don't have that classroom or educational experience. So so who are we trying to address here? Is this a person who has not been maybe on a continuum with us with Ed Leader 1 and 2 within our state? Is this, we're looking at people who are coming in for less than 5 years classroom experience and haven't been in, say, our leadership track? Is that who we're trying to address with this?
I think it runs the gamut, because even folks that have gone on our leadership track, if they were moved up to assistant principal after 3 years, then
Right.
the current policy prohibits us from issuing the Ed Leader 3. So they wouldn't be able to serve as a chief academic officer either if their superintendent didn't hold the certification.
So
And so I think it addresses all of our Ed leaders personally.
So Jim, in response to your question, I don't have a problem with this. I would like them to be in that educational arena, but must they be in the educational arena at all for the 5-year period in order to get the Ed Leader through?
So the only thing that we're changing is reducing it from 5 years of teaching experience to 3 years of teaching experience. They still have to have the master's, they still have to have that superintendent exam, they still have to have held the Ed Leader 2 or a comparable out of state if it's someone from out of state. And they still have to have 5 years of experience, leadership experience at the school or district level. So the only thing we're changing is the reduction from 5 years of teaching experience to 3 years of teaching experience. So they still will have had to have been a teacher in the classroom as well.
And I don't have a problem with that at all. I think it's an alignment with our policies that's long overdue. And while I have just a quick minute, I do want to thank y'all for this total rewrite and realignment, because from a practitioner's point of view, sometimes it was very difficult to sift through this when you had what seemingly were maybe contradictory sections or ones that you could read differently. So I do appreciate the hard work with this, and thank you to your staff. And could you just, one quick thing, which chapter 9? I see where you provide, we're throwing out 1 through 8 and 11 through 13. But just give me the title of chapter 9 that we haven't gotten to yet that's still staying.
So chapter 9 is essentially the educator ethics. It's what, we are going to be revising it, but it's what's due around revocation, suspension for cheating, for criminal activity, all those types of things. We are working on that one. It's just a little bit more in-depth revision, and we weren't quite ready for that yet.
Thank you. One more clarification. What organization did you say supported this?
So we had a meeting with LaSaspa leadership and LACD leadership. So LaSaspa is the Human Resource Personnel Association, and LACD, of course, is the Teacher Preparation Association. So we had a meeting with both of the leadership teams of those organizations and walked them through all these revisions.
Thank you.
Well,
Mr. Rob, I just want to echo Dr. Bope's comments as well as Superintendent Bochet, and I really appreciate the level of detail and the time and effort your team put into this. But I do have one question. I'm curious if you could just help me out a little bit with the changes that were made to the middle school and high school math certification, and how that might come into play with the adequate professional certificate.
So the both of those exams are exams that, the high school math exam is an exam that is one of the options for the math for professionals. But both of those exams, what ETS did is they looked at the structure of the test and the percentages of questions that were devoted to each of the topics. And there was a larger percentage of questions that was devoted to the higher level mathematics topics that many high school educators will never even teach. And so it was prohibiting a lot of educators from passing that exam. And so they restructured the percentages to decrease the number of higher level, and they're broadening the other groups to kind of bring in alignment so that it's more along the lines of the types of math that the high school math educators will be teaching. You still have those higher level questions on there, but it's not such a large percentage.
Okay, so there's, just to make sure I get it clear, so there's still 2 certifications, one for middle school, one for high school.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
So there's still 2 certifications, one for middle school and one for high school.
Yes, sir.
And the math for professionals, you could apply to either.
So math for professionals, you can get about 30 hours of math coursework. That's one of the requirements. Or you can have a degree in mathematics or a STEM, or you can pass this high school math exam. And so the high school math exam restructuring would apply to the math for professionals.
So to get the math for professional certificate, you have to have a high school exam. The middle school exam would come into play.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you so much.
You have anyone else? Robin?
Yeah, I had a similar question about the elimination of minimum grade point average requirements for the TAP. A similar question for the practitioners, the people in the field on the board. Do y'all have a concern with eliminating GPA requirements?
Which page are you on?
This is the 4th bullet on the executive summary and recommendation. Allow the issuance of temporary authority to teach certifications to applicants who fail to meet minimum grade point average requirements.
Responding to that.
Please,
thank you. Point of view, relevant, in some of the, we currently have that in place for teacher preparation programs. So I guess this is meant to be in alignment with the TAP, in alignment with that. For example, I'll tell you, I had a situation. We were going to hire a teacher, or put them in our teacher prep program, who 15 years ago went to Tulane University and got a degree in, I forgot, it was psychology, sociology, something in that. And as she described it to us, she belonged to a sorority, had a really good time, never failed anything, came out with a 2.3 GPA. Never thought anything more about it, went off and did something else. That prohibited her from being, she didn't have to do 5, prohibited her from being in teacher prep programs or anything. In order to raise that entire body of work from a 2 or whatever she had to a 2.5, she would have had to take over 100 credit hours in college of all A's and mostly A's and B's in order to raise the entire undergraduate GPA to a 2.5. Now, we're getting several of those types of people who are coming maybe mid-career or mid-life, looking to come into the teaching profession, that maybe had a GPA that was right under or under the 2.5 and has not been allowed to enter any of these teacher preparation programs without extensive undergraduate coursework to go back and do, which is prohibited. So I'm not, I'll be honest, I'm not as concerned if they're right under that 2.5, as long as they're passing practice exams, they're showing and demonstrating now knowledge of the content area that they're teaching, and passing and learning the instructional strategies. So, that's just.
Someone else?
Thank you.
All right. John?
Thank you, and thank you for all of the hard work. It's evident. I just curious if there was any conversation about, this kind of goes back to the education leader certification, any conversation about other leaders from other industries or potentially the military or those that have a more non-traditional background, perhaps that they don't have the education, sort of the 3 years, but they have a lot of analogous sort of leadership experience. I don't know if discussions were had on that, but I'm curious.
So we felt that that was a much more in-depth process, and we would need to do a bit more research to be able to bring that for this round of revisions. It is something that we absolutely can consider. The primary goal of this particular revision was outside of the major shifts that we saw as big problems through TSAC, through organizations, things like that. We wanted to bring everything in alignment and make it consistent. And so that was the primary reason for this particular change. However, we would absolutely be open to furthering those conversations in the future to consider, business, individuals in the business industry or anything like that that may want to come into education. But that's much more involved conversations than we had about this particular change. Thank you.
What else? Okay, I do have one public comment. It's Mark Thomas, with the Louisiana Association of Educators, supports the recommendation with Bishop Dr. Street. Do we have any objection to the motion? Hearing none, the motion passes. Next item, please.
Mr. Rock, before we move on, I just want to myself compliment Christy Blue, Ryan Grimion, and the entire team and Dr. Legier's department for the tremendous amount of work they did here. You may not be aware, but the certification team processes, correct me if I'm wrong, but nearly 40,000 applications a year and responds to over 15,000 questions. So it's a tremendous body of work, so thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Thank you. Next item, please.
Your next item is on page 186, item 6.1, consideration of executive session regarding the discussion of the character, professional competence, or physical or mental health of a person in accordance with Louisiana Revised Statute 4216 regarding certification for the following persons: Carolyn Barahona and Anna Machia M. Joseph.
We got a motion to go into executive session. Moved by Dr. Davis. Is there a second? Second by Mr. Collins. Then we go into executive session. Is there any public comment or board discussion on the matter before we take a roll call vote? Roll call.
Dr. Bofi?
Yes.
Mr. Castile?
Yes.
Dr. Davis?
Yes.
Ms. Ellis?
Yes.
Mr. Garvey?
Yes.
Ms. Holloway?
Yes.
Mr. Mellering?
Yes.
Mr. Morris?
Yes.
Ms. Orange Jones?
Yes.
Ms. Bochet?
Yes.
Mr. Rock?
Yes.
Motion passes.
I will advise the audience that we will be in executive session for the length of time necessary for the discussion. No votes will be taken while the board is in executive session. All votes will be made in public. Additionally, public disclosure is not required of matters discussed. You are properly on executive session. At this time, the educator, thank you, Mr. Minister, and recess to go into executive session.
Oh, not one of these. Okay, good. Thank you. Yeah. I'm gonna have to tell you the funny thing my people have
motion to reconvene the Executive Committee and continue with the regular order of the agenda, vote on the items discussed in today's session. Any motion? Motion by Dr. Davies. Second. Second by Ms. Howard. Hold on.
You only need 2 people.
For the committee, yes. Correct.
Okay.
All right.
Item 6 items.
The next item is on page 200, item 6.3, consideration of a records review regarding the certification status of Dr. Carolyn Barahona. The recommendation is to grant, deny, or refer.
We have a motion.
I make a motion to grant.
Okay, second. Move second by Ms.
Actually, I'm sorry.
You know it. Okay.
Wait, who made the motion?
Motion by Dr. Davis.
Melinda Davis. Ashley Evans.
Ashley, yeah. Okay. All right. Any objection to the motion? Yeah, now the motion passed.
Your next item is on page 222, item 6.4, consideration of a records review regarding the certification status of Ms. Anamachia M. Joseph. The recommendation is to grant, deny, or refer.
We have a motion.
Make a motion to grant.
Grant, we have a second. Second by Ms. Holloway. The motion, any objection to the motion? Yeah, now the motion passed.
That concludes your agenda.
Stand adjourned.